Medieval's evil queens and their evil schemes. History loves kings. But the Middle Ages were shaped just as much by queens, women who ruled not only through crowns, but through fear, manipulation, betrayal, and blood-cold intelligence. These were not passive royal wives. These were women who controlled armies without wearing armor, destroyed rivals without holding swords, and rewrote dynasties using poison, whispers, and carefully timed lies. In a brutal medieval world dominated by men, only the most ruthless women survived at the top. And some of them didn't just survive, they terrified entire kingdoms. This is the story of medieval history's most evil queens and the schemes that made them legends. Not legends of beauty or grace, but of power without mercy. Medieval queens lived in a dangerous contradiction. They were expected to be obedient, silent, and loyal. Yet they were also expected to produce heirs, secure alliances, and protect dynasties, often in courts filled with enemies who wanted them dead or replaced. Many queens learned quickly that kindness was a weakness. And so they became something else. They became strategists. They became manipulators. They became monsters, at least according to the chroniclers who feared them. And sometimes, those chroniclers weren't exaggerating. One of the greatest weapons an evil queen possessed was invisibility. Kings signed documents. Kings led armies. Kings took the blame. Queens worked in silence. They controlled marriages, chose advisors, spread rumors, arranged accidents, and decided who lived close to the throne and who disappeared. A medieval queen didn't need an army to destroy you. She only needed time. Among the most feared of all medieval queens was Isabella of France, later remembered as the she-wolf of England. Born into the powerful French royal family, Isabella was married off to King Edward II of England while still a teenager. On paper, she was a queen consort. In reality, she was trapped in a humiliating marriage. Edward II openly favored male companions over his wife, granting them titles, lands, and influence while Isabella was sidelined and mocked. Worse, these favorites often insulted her publicly. But Isabella did not break. She watched. She remembered. She waited. And when she struck with terrifying precision. Isabella learned quickly that public rebellion was impossible. So she chose private conspiracy. She built alliances quietly, especially with nobles who resented Edward's favorites. She played the role of the neglected wife while secretly gathering support. Then came the most shocking betrayal imaginable. Isabella took a lover, Roger Mortimer, a powerful noble, and together they planned something unthinkable. The overthrow of a king. Not a foreign invasion. Not a civil war led by lords. But a queen leading the destruction of her own husband. When Isabella returned to England with Mortimer and a small army, support flooded in. Edward II's allies abandoned him almost immediately. Within weeks, the King of England was captured by forces loyal to his wife. Isabella forced Edward to abdicate the throne in favor of their young son. She ruled as regent, while Mortimer effectively controlled the kingdom. Edward II was imprisoned. Then, mysteriously, he died. Officially, the cause was never confirmed. Unofficially, medieval rumor described a death so brutal that even chroniclers hesitated to write it down. Whether the rumors were true or exaggerated didn't matter. Isabella's reputation was sealed. She was no longer a queen. She was a predator. But Isabella was not unique. Across medieval Europe, queens learned that power came at a price, and many were willing to pay it in blood. Another name whispered with fear was Blanche of Castile, a queen who ruled France not as a wife, but as a regent with absolute authority. When her husband died, Blanche ruled on behalf of her young son, Louis IX. The French nobles expected weakness. Instead, they encountered steel. Blanche crushed rebellions mercilessly. She imprisoned rival nobles, broke alliances, and ensured her son's throne through ruthless political control. She trusted no one. She forgave no betrayal. And she ruled France with an iron grip that shocked even seasoned warriors. Enemies accused her of cruelty. Supporters called her necessary. Either way, she proved a terrifying truth of medieval politics. A woman with power, and nothing to lose, was more dangerous than any knight. But not all evil queens ruled openly. Some ruled from the shadows, where history barely recorded their crimes. One of the darkest examples was Fredegund, Queen of Neustria. Fredegund did not inherit power. She clawed her way to it. Originally a servant, Fredegund became the mistress of King Chilperic I. She eliminated rivals with poison, including the king's legitimate wife. Then she became queen. But her ambition did not stop there. Fredegund turned the royal court into a battlefield of assassinations. She ordered murders disguised as accidents. She framed enemies with false accusations. She eliminated children who threatened her son's inheritance. Nothing was sacred, not family, not alliances, not even religious sanctuary. Chroniclers described her as cunning, cold, and utterly remorseless. In a time when women were expected to be gentle, Fredegund became a symbol of uncontrolled cruelty. And yet, she ruled. Because fear worked. Medieval queens understood something brutal about their world. Mercy was optional. Survival was not. And the crown did not protect the weak. It rewarded the ruthless. These women were not born villains. They were shaped by courts where betrayal was currency, where marriage was warfare, and where death was a political tool. Some historians argue they were no worse than male rulers of their time. But what made them unforgettable was how unexpected their cruelty was. The Middle Ages did not expect queens to destroy kings. And yet, they did. As the medieval world grew darker, with crusades, plagues, and endless wars, the role of queens grew even more dangerous. Some became symbols of stability. Others became nightmares. And some became both. In the Middle Ages, the most dangerous crimes were not committed on battlefields. They were committed in bedrooms, in chapels, at banquets, behind smiles and prayers. For medieval queens, violence rarely looked like violence. It looked like illness. It looked like divine punishment. It looked like fate. And no weapon was more feared than poison. Poison was silent. Poison left no wounds. Poison allowed a queen to remain innocent while her enemies slowly died. And medieval courts were filled with it. Queens who mastered poison mastered plausible denial. If a rival died, it was God's will. If a husband collapsed, it was illness. If a child didn't survive infancy, it was tragedy. Or so everyone pretended to believe. One queen whose name became synonymous with poison was Queen Brunhilde of Austrasia. Brunhilde was intelligent, educated, and politically ambitious, qualities that terrified the male nobility of her time. She ruled as regent for decades, outliving kings, rivals, and even her own children. But Brunhilde did not merely rule. She eliminated. Her reign became a long chain of conspiracies, executions, and alleged poisonings. Nobles who opposed her disappeared. Bishops who challenged her authority were imprisoned or killed. She was accused of ordering assassinations from behind monastery walls, using servants and courtiers as her hands. And unlike many queens, Brunhilde ruled directly, issuing commands herself. To her enemies, she was a demon in silk. To her supporters, she was the only thing holding the kingdom together. But eventually, the fear she inspired turned against her. Brunhilde's end was one of the most brutal executions in medieval history. Captured by enemies who despised her power, she was accused of decades of murder, treason, and corruption. Her punishment was not quick. It was public. She was tortured, humiliated, and finally executed in a manner designed to erase her authority forever. Her death sent a clear message to medieval women. Rule too long, rule too boldly, and the world will punish you for it. But Brunhilde was not the last queen to hide cruelty behind religion. Faith was one of the most effective disguises medieval queens could wear. A praying queen was a trusted queen, and some used that trust mercilessly. One of the most controversial figures in medieval England was Margaret of Anjou, wife of King Henry VI. Margaret was not born to rule England, but England collapsed without her. Henry VI was weak, indecisive, and mentally unstable. While he prayed, Margaret governed. And when England descended into the Wars of the Roses, Margaret became something terrifying. A queen who embraced war. Margaret raised armies. She negotiated alliances. She ordered executions. And she showed no mercy to enemies, even when they were children. Her enemies accused her of ordering massacres, encouraging brutality, and pushing England into endless bloodshed to protect her son's claim. To her supporters, she was a mother fighting for survival. To her enemies, she was a butcher queen. And history remembers her as both. What made Margaret truly feared was not just her actions, but her refusal to step aside. In a time when queens were expected to retreat, she advanced. She spoke in councils. She commanded loyalty. She became the face of Lancastrian resistance. And that made her unforgivable. Medieval chroniclers often described evil queens using the same language. They were called unnatural, unwomanly, monstrous. Not because their crimes were worse than men's, but because they committed them openly. And society could not accept that. But some queens were careful never to appear powerful at all. They ruled through confessors, advisors, and religious authority. One whisper in the ear of a bishop could destroy a noble family. One accusation of heresy could eliminate a rival without lifting a finger. And queens knew it. In Spain, Queen Urraca of Leon and Castile ruled during a time of chaos. Her reign was marked by civil war, betrayal, and violence. She married for power, then turned against her own husband. She allied with nobles, then betrayed them when they became inconvenient. Church leaders accused her of scandal and corruption. Nobles accused her of cruelty. But Urraca survived because she understood medieval politics better than anyone. She kept enemies divided. She kept allies fearful. And she never allowed herself to be isolated. Urraca's rule exposed a harsh truth. A medieval queen did not need to be loved. She only needed to ensure that everyone else was weaker. Many queens also learned how to weaponize motherhood. A child was not just an heir. A child was leverage. Queens threatened rivals by controlling access to heirs, manipulating succession laws, and spreading doubts about legitimacy. If a child could be declared illegitimate, entire bloodlines could collapse. And some queens destroyed dynasties without spilling a drop of blood. Accusations were deadly. An accusation of adultery. An accusation of treason. An accusation whispered at the right moment. Once planted, they grew uncontrollably. Queens did not need proof. They needed timing. As the Middle Ages progressed, the image of the evil queen became deeply embedded in culture. Stories exaggerated their cruelty. Failures were blamed on them. Wars started by men were blamed on women. But beneath the myths were real rulers who understood one brutal rule of medieval life. If you did not control the narrative would destroy you. So some queens chose to become villains on their own terms. In the Middle Ages, reputation was power. A single rumor could destroy a noble house. A whispered accusation could end a reign. And no one understood this better than medieval queens. Because while kings ruled through force, queens often ruled through perception. What people believed mattered more than what was true. And belief could be shaped. One of the most dangerous tools in a queen's arsenal was scandal. Scandal did not require proof. It did not require witnesses. It only required repetition. Queens who mastered scandal could ruin rivals without touching them, turning entire courts against a single target. And medieval society was eager to believe the worst, especially about women. Few queens were surrounded by more scandal than Joan of Navarre, Queen Consort of England. After the death of her husband, King Henry IV, Joan remained politically influential and wealthy. Too influential. Too independent. And that made her dangerous. Whispers began to spread. Accusations of witchcraft. Claims of secret plots. Rumors of forbidden knowledge. No evidence was ever produced. It didn't matter. Joan was arrested, her wealth seized, and her reputation destroyed, all through suspicion alone. Though she was eventually released, the message was clear. A queen who did not submit to control could be neutralized by rumor. And queens learned from this. They learned how to use the same weapon against others. Some queens went further, using marriage itself as a political trap. Marriage was never about love. It was about control. And controlling who married whom could decide the fate of nations. Eleanor of Aquitaine was not evil in the traditional sense, but she terrified kings. She was intelligent, wealthy, and fiercely independent. She married two kings of two different empires, and manipulated both. When her marriage to the French king failed, she walked away with enormous territories intact. Then she married the future King Henry II of England and became one of the most powerful women in Europe. But Eleanor did not remain loyal. She supported rebellions by her own sons against their father. She negotiated alliances behind Henry's back. And when caught, she was imprisoned for years. To her enemies, Eleanor was treacherous. To her allies, she was brilliant. To history, she was proof that a queen who understood marriage could bend empires. But not all queens were so visible. Some operated in near-total secrecy. In Scandinavia, Queen Margaret I of Denmark became one of the most powerful rulers of the medieval North. She united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her control through the Kalmar Union. But she did it without ever wearing a crown as queen regnant. Instead, she ruled as regent, manipulating succession laws, marriages, and noble loyalties. She eliminated rivals quietly. She sidelined opposition carefully. And she controlled kings like chess pieces. Margaret understood something crucial. Open cruelty created enemies. Quiet domination created obedience. And so her reign became one of stability, built on fear disguised as order. Queens also understood the power of sexual accusation. In medieval society, a woman's honor was fragile. But a man's reputation could be shattered if tied to immorality or weakness. Queens used this mercilessly. A noble accused of improper conduct with a queen was doomed. Whether the accusation was true or not was irrelevant. The damage was irreversible. Some queens exploited this to eliminate ambitious courtiers, jealous rivals, or threatening advisors. One whisper in the right ear could end a career or a life. In France, Isabeau of Bavaria became one of the most hated queens in history. Her husband, King Charles VI, suffered from severe mental illness, leaving Isabeau to wield enormous influence. Enemies accused her of corruption, betrayal, and scandalous behavior. They blamed her for France's collapse during the 100 Years' War. They portrayed her as selfish and immoral. But modern historians suspect much of this was propaganda. Yet even propaganda can be a weapon. And Isabeau used her image strategically. She negotiated with enemies. She secured her children's positions. She survived while others fell. But history never forgave her. Because a queen who ruled during chaos was an easy target. Medieval queens lived under constant surveillance. Every movement watched. Every word judged. Every relationship scrutinized. Some queens resisted this pressure. Others embraced it, and turned scrutiny into power. Scandal became currency. If you controlled scandal, you controlled the court. And queens who mastered this could destroy kings without ever breaking the law. But there was one final domain where medieval queens exercised their darkest influence. Succession. Who inherited the throne determined everything. And queens often decided that question long before kings realized it. In medieval politics, nothing mattered more than blood. Who was born legitimate? Who was recognized as heir? Who was quietly erased from the line of succession? And no one stood closer to the heart of succession than the queen. She gave birth to the future. She controlled access to heirs. She shaped the story of legitimacy itself. And that made her terrifying. Medieval queens quickly understood a brutal truth. You didn't have to kill a rival directly. You only had to ensure their children never ruled. Succession was fragile. Infant mortality was high. Illness was common. Accidents were easy to arrange. And when a child died, questions were dangerous to ask. God's will was always a convenient explanation. One of the most infamous queens associated with ruthless succession politics was Catherine de' Medici. Though technically later medieval transitioning into early modern Europe, her methods were born from medieval court culture. Catherine ruled France from behind the throne for decades, controlling kings who were her sons. Her goal was simple: preserve her bloodline at any cost. Catherine was surrounded by enemies, noble families who wanted her sons weak, removable, or dead. So she played a long game. She arranged marriages like traps. She balanced rival factions against each other. She allowed enemies to weaken themselves. And when the moment came, she struck. The violence associated with her reign shocked Europe. But Catherine rarely acted openly. She ruled through councils, through advisors, through timing, and through silence. Those who underestimated her vanished politically or permanently. But long before Catherine, medieval queens were already mastering this art. In Byzantium, Empress Irene of Athens ruled with chilling precision. She began as regent for her son, Constantine VI. At first, she ruled in his name. Then she realized something dangerous. Her son was no longer necessary. Irene blinded her own son to remove him from power. Blinding, in Byzantine law, made a ruler unfit to govern. Constantine survived, but was destroyed politically. Irene then ruled alone as empress. A mother ruling by destroying her child. It shocked the medieval world. And it proved something no one wanted to admit. Blood meant nothing when power was at stake. Medieval queens learned that motherhood could be weaponized. A queen could present herself as protector, while quietly eliminating threats to her children's rule. And no one dared accuse a grieving mother. In England, Matilda of Flanders, wife of William the Conqueror, played a quieter but equally effective role. While William conquered England through war, Matilda ruled Normandy with absolute authority. She suppressed rebellions. She controlled noble families. She ensured her son's succession through careful political marriages and strategic favoritism. Enemies disappeared into obscurity. Supporters rose. And the Norman dynasty stabilized. Matilda rarely appears in stories of cruelty, because she understood the most effective evil was invisible. But not all queens hid their ambitions so well. Some were openly accused of killing heirs. Gertrude of Morania, Queen of Hungary, became infamous for her favoritism and political manipulation. She elevated her own family above native nobles, creating resentment that exploded into violence. Eventually, Gertrude was assassinated by nobles who feared she would permanently alter succession and power. Her death was not mourned. It was celebrated. And that alone reveals how deeply she was feared. Queens who interfered with succession walked a thin line. If they succeeded, history often condemned them. If they failed, they died. Another method queens used was delegitimization. If you could convince the court that an heir was illegitimate, everything collapsed. Accusations of adultery were deadly. A whispered doubt about paternity could destroy a child's future. And queens knew how to plant those doubts. In some cases, queens accused rivals of adultery to eliminate their children. In others, queens spread rumors about their own children's legitimacy, only to later prove it false and emerge stronger. Truth was flexible. Power was not. The medieval world was obsessed with lineage. Queens exploited that obsession mercilessly. But succession schemes did not end with children. They extended to regencies. A child king meant a ruling queen. And ruling queens rarely gave power back willingly. Many queens delayed their sons' independence. They controlled councils. They dismissed advisors. They ruled long after they were supposed to step aside. And when sons resisted, consequences followed. Some sons were imprisoned. Some were discredited. Some simply disappeared from records. And chroniclers learned not to ask why. By the late Middle Ages, the fear of the evil queen was deeply ingrained. Not because queens were inherently cruel, but because they occupied the most dangerous position in politics. Close enough to power to control it. Invisible enough to escape blame. In the Middle Ages, nothing was more dangerous than God. Not armies. Not crowns. Not even kings. Because God could justify anything. And queens understood this better than anyone. Religion shaped medieval life from birth to death. It decided who ruled, who obeyed, and who was condemned. A queen who controlled religion controlled morality itself. And morality could destroy enemies more effectively than swords. Many medieval queens presented themselves as devout, humble, and obedient to God. They built churches. They funded monasteries. They surrounded themselves with priests and confessors. But behind this image, some used faith as a shield and a blade. One accusation of heresy could end a noble family. One claim of divine disapproval could justify imprisonment, exile, or execution. And queens learned how to whisper those accusations at exactly the right moment. One of the most powerful examples was Queen Melisende of Jerusalem. Melisende ruled a fragile crusader kingdom surrounded by enemies and divided by internal rivalries. She was intelligent, educated, and deeply involved in church politics. And she ruled through religious legitimacy. Melisende understood that in a holy kingdom authority came from God. So she aligned herself closely with the church. She appointed loyal bishops. She funded religious institutions. She presented herself as God's chosen protector of Jerusalem. And anyone who opposed her could be painted as opposing God. Her enemies accused her of manipulation and ambition. But Melisende survived decades of political turmoil because she cloaked every decision in religious justification. War became holy duty. Punishment became divine justice. Opposition became sin. Religion also allowed queens to rewrite morality. What was cruel could become righteous. What was political could become sacred. And what was evil could become holy. In France, Blanche of Castile, already feared as a ruthless regent, used religion masterfully. She portrayed rebellions against her rule as rebellion against divine order. She encouraged sermons that condemned disobedience. She ensured the church benefited from her rule and returned that support publicly. Nobles who resisted her authority found themselves isolated not just politically, but spiritually. And isolation in the Middle Ages was fatal. Some queens went even further, using superstition and fear of the supernatural. The medieval mind was deeply vulnerable to signs, omens, and divine punishment. Queens exploited this. If a rival fell ill, it was God's judgment. If crops failed in an enemy's lands, It was divine displeasure. If a noble family collapsed, it was punishment for sin. Queens did not need to prove anything. They only needed priests willing to repeat the message. Ironically, queens were also vulnerable to religious attack. Accusations of witchcraft, immorality, or sacrilege could destroy them. And so some queens struck first. By aligning themselves closely with the church, queens protected themselves while weaponizing religion against others. They became untouchable and terrifying. In England, Queen Isabella of France, already infamous for overthrowing her husband, also used religious language to justify her actions. Edward II was portrayed as sinful, immoral, and unfit to rule. Isabella presented herself as restoring moral order. Rebellion became reform. Overthrow became salvation. And murder, if it occurred, became silence. The church did not openly condemn her, because condemning Isabella meant condemning success. And medieval institutions rarely opposed power that worked. Queens also used pilgrimage and charity strategically. Public displays of devotion distracted from private cruelty. A queen could order political destruction in the morning and fund a hospital in the afternoon. And history often remembered the hospital. This duality made evil queens difficult to judge. Were they villains, or simply rulers doing what survival required? The answer depended on who won. Some queens manipulated religious orders themselves. They placed loyal family members as abbots or abbesses. They controlled monastic lands. They ensured prayers were said for allies, and silence for enemies. Religion became administration. Holiness became hierarchy. But the most dangerous religious weapon was excommunication. If a queen could influence the church enough, she could isolate a rival completely. No allies. No sacraments. No legitimacy. And once isolated, destruction followed naturally. By the late Middle Ages, the line between religion and politics had nearly vanished. Queens stood at that intersection. And those who mastered it became untouchable. Yet even religious power had limits. Because fear could turn inward. The same church that supported a queen could one day condemn her. And when that happened, the fall was brutal. Not every queen remembered as evil truly was. But in the Middle Ages, history was written by survivors, and survivors rarely forgave powerful women. Once a queen lost favor, everything she had ever done was reinterpreted as wicked. Mercy became manipulation. Strength became cruelty. Intelligence became deception. And the label evil became permanent. One of the most striking examples is Queen Ealhfrith of England. She was intelligent, politically active, and determined to secure her son's throne. And she succeeded. But the cost was her reputation. Ealhfrith was accused of arranging the murder of her stepson, King Edward the Martyr. The story spread quickly. A young king, betrayed and killed by his stepmother so her own child could rule. It was a perfect story. Too perfect. There was no proof. Only rumor. Only motive. But motive was enough. Edward's death became a moral lesson, and Ealhfrith became the villain. Her son, Ethelred the Unready, took the throne, and history remembered his reign as disastrous. That failure retroactively condemned her. Because when a kingdom falls, someone must be blamed. And queens were convenient. Medieval chroniclers often used queens as symbols. If a reign was weak, the queen was manipulative. If a king failed, the queen was corrupt. If war erupted, the queen was ambitious. Men ruled. Women influenced. And influence was always suspicious. Another queen destroyed by narrative was Queen Ingeborg of Denmark, married to King Philip II of France. Philip rejected her almost immediately after marriage, claiming the union was invalid. Ingeborg was isolated, imprisoned, and humiliated for decades. But she never surrendered her title. She refused to accept rejection. She appealed to the church repeatedly, and her persistence made her dangerous. Philip's supporters portrayed her as stubborn, unstable, and disruptive. They painted her resistance as defiance of order. Yet Ingeborg's crime was simple. She refused to disappear. But some queens truly earned their dark reputations. And history did not need exaggeration. Queen Joanna I of Naples ruled in a world of betrayal and bloodshed. Her reign was filled with intrigue, murder accusations, and violent power struggles. She was accused of orchestrating the killing of her husband. She survived conspiracies, rebellions, and invasions. And she responded with ruthless political calculation. Joanna married multiple times, each marriage serving a political purpose. When alliances shifted, loyalties vanished. And so did husbands. Whether she ordered murders or merely benefited from them remains debated. But one thing is clear. Joanna ruled by eliminating threats before they eliminated her. Eventually, she was captured, imprisoned, and killed by rivals who claimed moral justification. They said they were saving Naples from corruption. But in truth, they were saving it from a woman who refused to surrender power. This pattern repeated endlessly. Queens rose. Queens ruled. Queens were hated. Queens fell. And once they fell, their stories became warnings. Medieval society feared women who ruled because they disrupted the natural order. A ruling queen was a contradiction. And contradictions were dangerous. Chroniclers emphasized their flaws. They exaggerated their crimes. They ignored their successes. Because history needed villains. But what makes medieval evil queens so fascinating is not just what they did. It is what they revealed. They exposed how fragile power really was. They proved that politics did not belong exclusively to men. They showed that cruelty was not gendered. Some queens embraced the role of villain. Others were forced into it. But all of them understood something essential. Power was never given. It was taken. By the end of the Middle Ages, the image of the evil queen was deeply embedded in culture. She appeared in chronicles, in sermons, in stories told to frighten children. She became a symbol of ambition unchecked. Yet without these queens, medieval history would collapse. Dynasties would vanish. Kingdoms would fragment. Successions would fail. To understand medieval evil queens, we must first understand the world that created them. The Middle Ages were not gentle. They were not fair. They were not forgiving. They were a world where power was unstable, life was short, and mercy was often a fatal mistake. In such a world, survival itself could look like cruelty. Medieval queens did not rule in safety. They ruled surrounded by enemies. Foreign courts wanted them weak. Nobles wanted them removed. Rivals wanted their children replaced. Even their own husbands could turn against them. And when a queen fell, she rarely fell alone. Her children followed. A queen who failed was not exiled. She was erased. This reality forced queens to make decisions most people never faced. Do you trust the noble who swears loyalty today but plotted rebellion yesterday? Do you spare a rival child who might grow up to destroy your son? Do you step aside peacefully and hope mercy is returned? History shows what happened to queens who chose mercy too often. They disappeared. The medieval political system rewarded decisiveness, not compassion. Kings executed traitors publicly. Queens eliminated threats quietly. The difference was style, not morality. Yet queens were judged differently. When a king ordered executions, it was authority. When a queen did the same, it was cruelty. When a king manipulated marriages, it was diplomacy. When a queen did it, it was corruption. This double standard shaped their legacies. Many so-called evil queens acted as regents. They ruled on behalf of sons too young to protect themselves. Every threat to the throne was a threat to a child. And maternal instinct, combined with absolute power, could become merciless. A queen regent had one primary duty: ensure the dynasty survives. Everything else was secondary. Morality bent under that pressure. Queens also lacked one advantage kings had: legitimacy by default. A king ruled because he was male. A queen ruled because she had proven herself indispensable. That meant constant justification, constant dominance, constant control. If she showed weakness, she invited rebellion. If she showed mercy, she encouraged ambition. If she trusted too easily, she died. This environment did not create kindness. It created calculation. Even queens remembered as villains often brought stability. They ended civil wars. They centralized authority. They strengthened states. But stability built through fear rarely earned gratitude. Only resentment. Medieval chroniclers, mostly men, struggled to explain powerful women. So they moralized them. They turned political decisions into personal sins. They framed strategy as selfishness. They reduced complex rule into simple evil. But some queens understood this narrative trap. They leaned into it. If they were going to be feared anyway, they chose to control the fear. Fear kept nobles obedient. Fear kept rivals cautious. Fear bought time. And time was power. What makes medieval evil queens unforgettable is not their cruelty alone. It is their effectiveness. They ruled in impossible circumstances and survived longer than anyone expected. And survival itself was an accusation. Yet their stories also reveal something uncomfortable. When women rule, their mistakes are remembered forever. When men rule, their mistakes become footnotes. The evil queen became a warning tale. A story used to discourage female authority. A reminder of what happens when women step outside prescribed roles. But history cannot erase what happened. These queens ruled. They decided wars. They shaped borders. They controlled dynasties. And without them, medieval Europe would look very different. Their schemes were not accidents. They were responses. Responses to danger. Responses to betrayal. Responses to a world that demanded strength at any cost. In the final part, we will bring all of this together. We will look at how the image of the evil queen survived beyond the Middle Ages, and why modern history is only now beginning to question it. Not to excuse them, but to understand them. The Middle Ages ended centuries ago, but the legend of the evil queen survived. Not in dusty chronicles alone, but in stories, fairy tales, and even the way historians have written about women in power. History remembers kings as rulers. It remembers queens as manipulators. Even when they saved kingdoms, built alliances, or strengthened dynasties, the narrative often focused on their cruelty, ambition, or cunning. Some of the most infamous queens became symbols, their actions magnified, their intentions questioned, and their methods immortalized as villainy. Isabella of France, the she-wolf of England, was remembered as a murderer of kings, not as the strategic regent who stabilized England after her husband's misrule. Blanche of Castile, feared for her ruthlessness, was rarely acknowledged for her skill in maintaining unity in France during civil wars. Catherine de' Medici, accused of orchestrating horrors such as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, was also a protector of her son's reigns and a shrewd diplomat in a perilous time. The pattern is clear. Medieval queens who wielded power effectively were often remembered negatively, their influence reframed as evil. This bias was not accidental. Chroniclers, mostly men, needed to explain why a woman could rule in a world dominated by men. The easiest explanation: she must be manipulative, deceitful, and dangerous. Thus, the legend of the evil queen was born, a mixture of truth, exaggeration, and fear projected onto women who dared to govern. Yet the legacy of these queens cannot be simplified into mere villainy. They survived in brutal courts, navigated political mines, and defended their dynasties against threats that would have destroyed most men. Some used marriage as a tool. Some used religion. Some used poison. Some simply mastered fear. All of them understood one immutable truth. In medieval politics, survival required ruthlessness. These queens also transformed succession, law, and governance. They strengthened royal authority, centralizing power where kingdoms might otherwise have fragmented. They reshaped alliances, sometimes saving nations from collapse. Even their so-called cruelty often had a purpose. It was deliberate, calculated, and effective. To call it evil is to ignore the realities of the time. And yet, the medieval narrative preferred myth over context. Stories of treachery, murder, and manipulation overshadowed lessons in strategy, diplomacy, and survival. Legends of poison, intrigue, and scandal endured because they were memorable, easily sensationalized, and morally straightforward. Women in power are dangerous. Modern historians have begun to challenge this view. They ask, were these queens truly evil, or were they simply adapted to a world that required ruthless action to survive? They examine documents, alliances, and letters that reveal intelligence, foresight, and care for their children and realms. Slowly, the story of the evil queen is being balanced. Yes, some committed morally questionable acts, but their survival shaped history. Medieval queens did not have the luxury of fairness. Their world demanded calculation, endurance, and sometimes cruelty. Yet, centuries later, we remember them primarily as monsters. From Isabella of France to Catherine de' Medici, from Fredegund to Joanna I of Naples, the pattern is undeniable. The closer a woman came to power, the more her reputation became a tale of evil rather than achievement. The evil queen became a symbol not just of female ambition, but of the threat it represented to a patriarchal society. And perhaps, that is why these stories endure. Because we are drawn to contradictions. To women who combine strength and cunning, motherhood and ambition, piety and ruthlessness. The evil queen is terrifying, but also impossible to ignore. The medieval image of the evil queen did more than entertain chroniclers. It shaped politics, society, and expectations of women for centuries. Courts began to expect queens to be subordinate, cautious, and passive. A single act of ambition or cleverness could invite suspicion, rumor, or outright rebellion. The myths of evil queens became a warning. Power for a woman was dangerous, morally suspect, and potentially destructive to the kingdom. The consequences of this perception were profound. It influenced alliances, marriages, and succession planning. Kings often married women not for their skill or intelligence, but for obedience and simplicity. Courtiers feared women who might act independently. Even children of queens were scrutinized more closely because maternal influence was considered dangerous. In short, the medieval world trapped ambitious queens in a cycle of suspicion, forcing them either to conform or risk annihilation. Yet, some queens refused to accept this fate. They leaned into the perception of evil, mastering fear as a tool, wielding power from behind the veil of morality, religion, or societal expectation. Fear became authority. Obedience was maintained without overt force. And reputations became legends. Isabella of France, who once led armies against her husband, exemplifies this. She understood that her power depended on perception. She framed her actions as moral correction and dynastic necessity. The very same acts that could have branded her a villain instead secured her influence and control. Catherine de' Medici, though later, perfected this strategy. Rumors of poison, plots, and witchcraft swirled around her, yet she remained untouchable for decades, steering France through civil war with a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and manipulation. In essence, the evil queen became a masterclass in psychological power. While kings relied on visible displays, armies, castles, decrees, queens relied on subtlety, invisibility, and calculated perception. She could control the court without wielding a sword. She could destroy rivals without shedding blood herself. And this invisible form of power, though less obvious, was no less effective, and often far more feared. Interestingly, the legacy of these queens endured not just in political culture, but in literature and folklore. Fairy tales, legends, and chronicles exaggerated cruelty to warn young women of ambition. The wicked queen archetype in tales like Snow White, Maleficent, and countless medieval moral stories drew directly from the lives and reputations of historical queens. Through story, these women became immortal, but often misunderstood. Yet historical scrutiny slowly uncovers nuance. Modern historians recognize that many so-called evil acts were pragmatic, not personal. Poisoning a rival may have been a defensive strategy. Manipulating succession may have prevented civil war. Spreading rumors may have preserved a dynasty. The medieval queen was a product of her environment, a world of shifting alliances, fragile succession, and brutal power struggles. In that context, cruelty was sometimes survival, not indulgence. Even the most notorious queens, Fredegund, Joanna I of Naples, Elizabeth Woodville, can be understood as skilled, strategic rulers navigating impossible circumstances. Their actions, while morally ambiguous, were effective. They shaped kingdoms, determined the fates of heirs, and altered history itself. And yet, history often reduces them to villainous archetypes, ignoring the subtlety, skill, and intelligence required to survive and thrive in the medieval world. The evil queen, then, is both myth and reality. A woman feared for ambition, cunning, and ruthlessness, but also a ruler whose influence was undeniable. She was a product of her era. She was a survivor. She was, above all, a reminder that power in the Middle Ages was rarely fair and never simple. The influence of medieval queens extended far beyond the walls of their palaces. Some wielded power quietly, guiding foreign policy and securing alliances. Others ruled openly, making decisions that determined the survival or destruction of entire kingdoms. Whether feared, hated, or misunderstood, these women were central figures in shaping the medieval world. Consider Blanche of Castile, regent for her young son Louis IX of France. Her authority extended over rebellious nobles, fragile alliances, and a kingdom recovering from civil war. Blanche crushed opposition with precision, often imprisoning rivals or seizing lands to weaken threats. Yet she did so while nurturing her son, preparing him to rule with wisdom and strength. Her influence stabilized France for decades. Without her ruthless guidance, France might have fractured under the pressures of a divided nobility. In England, Isabella of France used strategy and intrigue to change the monarchy forever. By overthrowing her husband, Edward II, she ensured that their son would inherit a throne strengthened by careful alliances. Her actions were controversial and bloody, but they demonstrated an understanding of political timing and necessity rarely attributed to women of her era. Through her ambition, England avoided prolonged chaos, even if her methods remain infamous. Across the Mediterranean, Joanna I of Naples navigated a kingdom beset by rebellion, invasion, and dynastic instability. She married strategically, fought political enemies, and eliminated threats with decisive force. Some historians call her ruthless, others recognize her as a master strategist in a kingdom where indecision meant destruction. Joanna's reign proves that medieval queens could shape national destiny, even at great personal risk. These queens also influenced succession, diplomacy, and law. Through marriage, they created alliances across nations. Through children, they preserved dynasties. Through strategic decisions, they prevented internal collapse and foreign invasion. Even accusations of cruelty often masked deliberate political decisions. Poison, imprisonment, and rumor were tools, not indulgences, used to preserve the realm. Consider the example of Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England during the Wars of the Roses. Henry VI, her husband, was weak and incapable of controlling the kingdom. Margaret stepped in, raising armies, negotiating alliances, and defending her son's claim to the throne. Her methods were controversial. She encouraged violence and sometimes acted decisively against enemies. But without her intervention, the Lancastrian dynasty might have collapsed entirely. History may condemn her ruthlessness, but her actions were instrumental in shaping England's political future. Even queens who relied on religious influence altered nations. Melisende of Jerusalem used church authority to secure her reign, influence law, and unify a kingdom threatened by internal factions and external enemies. Religion, in her hands, was both shield and sword. Through careful manipulation, she preserved a fragile kingdom in one of the most volatile regions of medieval Europe. The pattern is clear: medieval queens were not powerless ornaments. They were political actors, strategists, and sometimes ruthless survivors. Their methods were judged harshly because they transgressed gender norms, not because they were uniquely cruel. History remembers them as evil, yet their effectiveness proves otherwise. In many cases their legacies outlasted those of kings. Dynasties endured because queens acted decisively. Kingdoms stabilized because women navigated chaos. Borders were preserved and succession secured, sometimes at a personal cost that men did not face. Medieval queens did what was necessary. And history often misinterpreted necessity as malevolence. The stories of medieval queens did not end when their reigns did. They passed into folklore, chronicles, and eventually literature, where their actions were simplified into morality tales. The cunning, ambitious, and ruthless became the evil queen, a symbol of female ambition run amok. Consider the tales surrounding Isabella of France. Chroniclers emphasized her overthrow of Edward II, portraying her as a manipulative schemer who betrayed her husband for personal gain. Later storytellers amplified these accounts, turning Isabella into a legendary she-wolf, a woman whose cunning and ambition overshadowed her political achievements. The focus shifted from her strategic skill to her perceived cruelty. Similarly, Catherine de' Medici became a figure of superstition and fear in French history. Rumors of her involvement in poisonings, secret murders, and plots against nobles persisted for generations. The reality of her political acumen, balancing factional rivalries, securing her children's reigns, and negotiating with foreign powers, was overshadowed by legend. History remembered scandal, not strategy. Fairy tales and folklore transformed these queens even further. Stories of wicked stepmothers, malicious sorceresses, and jealous queens drew inspiration directly from the lives of women like Isabella, Joanna, and Catherine. The evil queen archetype in stories such as Snow White or Sleeping Beauty reflects centuries of cultural memory shaped by fear of female authority. This cultural evolution is significant. Medieval queens who ruled with intelligence and ruthlessness became warnings for future generations. Power for a woman was dangerous, morally suspect, and likely to end in disaster. Through literature, moral tales, and folklore, their legacies were simplified into archetypes that persisted long after the actual events had faded. Yet modern historical analysis challenges these interpretations. Historians now examine letters, treaties, and documents to understand the context of queens' decisions. They reveal a consistent pattern. Women who survived and ruled effectively often employed strategies that modern readers perceive as evil, but which were politically necessary. For instance, Blanche of Castile was called cruel for imprisoning rebellious nobles. Yet her actions prevented civil war and secured her son's throne. Melisende of Jerusalem was accused of manipulative piety. Yet her governance preserved a fragile kingdom in a hostile region. The so-called evil actions were often acts of survival, political necessity, or dynastic protection. Despite this, the archetype of the evil queen remains pervasive. It reflects deep-seated societal fears that women in power will be manipulative, ruthless, or immoral. It ignores context, disregards nuance, and reduces complex historical figures into simple villains. The medieval queen's shadow continues to influence perceptions of female authority even today. In literature, film, and popular culture, the evil queen serves as a cautionary tale. And yet, beneath the myth lies a record of real women who shaped history, defended dynasties, and survived in an era designed to limit them. Medieval queens survived because they were smart. Not merely cunning. Not merely ruthless. But deeply intelligent, politically astute, and capable of long-term planning in a world designed to destroy them. Every decision was calculated. Every alliance weighed. Every action measured against potential threats. One key skill was networking. Queens knew that power depended on relationships. Nobles, bishops, and advisors could be allies or enemies depending on timing, loyalty, and reward. A queen who built networks of influence could control courts without open warfare. She could protect her children, manage succession, and neutralize threats before they became dangerous. Blanche of Castile, Isabella of France, and Catherine de' Medici all exemplified this skill. They cultivated loyalty through favors, positions, and strategic marriages, while punishing betrayal decisively. Another skill was timing. Ruthless action at the wrong moment could ruin a queen. Hesitation could allow rivals to strike first. Queens measured carefully when to negotiate, when to act, when to remain silent. Margaret of Anjou raised armies only when her son's claim to the throne was in jeopardy. Melisende of Jerusalem intervened decisively in succession disputes only when factions threatened her kingdom. Timing, more than force, determined their survival. Manipulation of perception was equally vital. Medieval courts were filled with spies, chroniclers, and rumor-mongers. Reputation was fragile. A queen could appear pious, humble, or harmless while controlling the court from behind the scenes. She could allow enemies to underestimate her, only to strike when they were unprepared. Catherine de' Medici mastered this. She cultivated a public image of devout motherhood while manipulating politics, managing civil unrest, and preserving the monarchy. Queens also excelled in succession management. They knew the survival of their dynasty depended on heirs and legitimacy. Poison, rumor, alliances, and marriages were all tools to secure the future. A queen could prevent civil war by neutralizing threats, protecting a young heir, or strategically weakening a rival family. These actions were often labeled evil, but in context, they were necessary for the survival of the kingdom. A crucial, often overlooked skill was resilience. Queens endured betrayals, rebellions, imprisonment, accusations of witchcraft, and public vilification. They survived assassination attempts, political marginalization, and endless scrutiny. Few men in history faced as constant a threat to life and power as medieval queens did, and fewer survived. Finally, medieval queens mastered adaptability. Alliances shifted. Wars erupted. Kings died or became incapacitated. The court was unpredictable. A queen who could adapt, switch allegiances, alter strategy, negotiate rapidly, could outlast rivals and preserve her influence. Blanche of Castile adapted to internal rebellion. Isabella of France adapted to her husband's weakness and external pressure. Margaret of Anjou adapted to civil war and shifting loyalties. Adaptability was survival. And survival was power. The combination of intelligence, strategy, resilience, and adaptability made these queens extraordinary. They were not merely villains. They were rulers who mastered a brutal system, and did so when failure meant death, ruin, or obliteration. Yet history has often reduced their stories to villainy. Why? Because a woman who exercised power successfully challenged societal norms. Because success, when wielded by a queen, was threatening. Medieval queens became both feared and vilified, not necessarily for what they did, but for what their very existence represented: women capable of controlling kingdoms. Ruling a medieval kingdom was never just politics. For queens, it was personal. Every decision carried consequences for their families, reputations, and even their lives. Ambition, strategy, and ruthlessness often came at a tremendous personal cost. Many queens endured isolation. Courts were suspicious of women in power. Advisors whispered behind closed doors. Nobles plotted. Rebellion. Even family members could become threats. Isabella of France, for instance, spent much of her life maneuvering against her husband, estranged from her children at times, and navigating a kingdom divided by loyalty and resentment. Blanche of Castile ruled while grieving losses, balancing maternal care with political necessity, and isolating herself from court factions to maintain authority. Power required sacrifice. Loneliness became a constant companion. Queens also faced constant moral compromise. Decisions that protected their children or dynasties often involved betrayal, imprisonment, or execution of rivals. To survive and protect their heirs, queens could not afford sentimentality. Every act, whether ordering imprisonment, negotiating deadly alliances, or spreading rumors, was calculated. The result: a personal life overshadowed by politics, suspicion, and strategy. Few could trust anyone completely. Marriage was rarely a refuge. Many queens were trapped in unions designed for politics, not affection. Joanna I of Naples navigated multiple arranged marriages, each serving political ends. Her husbands became tools of alliance, not partners of trust or comfort. Even maternal relationships were complicated. Queens sometimes had to act against their children's rivals, or even against their own offspring, to preserve the dynasty. Public scrutiny added another layer of pressure. Every appearance, every speech, every charitable act or display of piety was analyzed. A single misstep could spark rumor, rebellion, or attack. Catherine de' Medici mastered the public gaze, balancing personal danger with the need to appear moral and devout while privately orchestrating political strategies. Queens learned to live with the tension between public perception and private necessity. Despite the isolation, manipulation, and moral compromise, some queens also found ways to assert identity. Through patronage of the arts, architecture, religion, or charitable works, they left enduring marks on culture and society. Blanche of Castile commissioned religious buildings. Catherine de' Medici promoted arts and festivals that shaped French culture. Isabella of France's influence on courtly diplomacy left lasting effects on England's political structure. Power had its price, but it also created opportunity for legacy. Yet the human cost remained undeniable. Sleep was often short. Fear was constant. Decisions weighed heavily, knowing that failure could mean death for themselves or their children. Every queen understood that the crown was both shield and noose. Survival required strength, cunning, and endurance beyond ordinary limits. Some queens eventually paid the ultimate price. Assassination, imprisonment, forced exile, and vilification were common outcomes for those who miscalculated, who hesitated, or whose enemies were stronger. The legends of evil queens often originate in these moments of downfall. The exile of Ingeborg of Denmark, the assassination of Gertrude of Morania, the imprisonment of Eleanor of Aquitaine's rivals. Yet even in defeat, their influence endured. The decisions they made, the dynasties they shaped, and the strategies they perfected continued to resonate long after their deaths. The power of medieval queens extended far beyond their immediate reigns. Every marriage arranged, every heir secured, Every rival neutralized had consequences that lasted decades, sometimes centuries. A queen's influence could determine whether a kingdom survived war, rebellion, or dynastic disputes, or collapsed entirely. Consider Margaret of Anjou in England. Her efforts during the Wars of the Roses shaped the Lancastrian dynasty for decades. She raised armies, negotiated alliances, and maneuvered politically to defend her son's claim. Though eventually defeated, her actions prolonged the Lancastrian line and forced the Yorkist opposition into complex negotiations. Her influence outlasted her, altering the course of English politics well beyond her lifetime. Similarly, Catherine de' Medici shaped French politics long after her death. Her children became monarchs of France, and her decisions influenced religious policy, diplomacy, and the balance of power in Europe for generations. Her use of intrigue, alliances, and strategic ruthlessness became a model, or warning, for future rulers. Queens also influenced international diplomacy. Through arranged marriages, treaties, and negotiations, they created alliances that determined the fate of nations. Blanche of Castile's management of her son Louis IX's succession ensured stability that allowed France to emerge as a centralized power in Europe. Margaret of Anjou's interventions forced England into prolonged conflict but ultimately shaped the Tudor succession, which unified England decades later. Even myths surrounding these queens affected politics. The fear of ambitious women in power created cultural constraints. Male rulers were cautious of queens' influence, advisors were wary, and successors were taught to respect, or fear, the potential of female authority. The stories of the evil queen served as both cautionary tales and political tools. Kings and advisors used the archetype to control women in power, to discredit rivals, or to justify harsh political decisions. The perception of queens as dangerous manipulators also influenced succession laws. Male heirs were often prioritized explicitly to avoid the threat of female rule. Regency arrangements were tightly controlled to limit queens' authority. Even when a queen acted out of necessity, history often remembered her as ambitious, manipulative, or evil. Yet the reality is more nuanced. Queens like Joanna I of Naples, Melisende of Jerusalem, and Isabella of France mastered survival in a world designed to punish them for ambition. They combined strategy, intelligence, and ruthlessness to preserve dynasties, defend kingdoms, and navigate impossible circumstances. The line between evil and effective was often determined by perspective. Medieval queens also shaped cultural memory. Fairy tales, legends, and literature inherited the archetype of the evil queen from these historical figures. The cunning, ambitious, and ruthless woman became a recurring symbol in European imagination. Stories such as Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, and countless medieval chronicles echo the lessons learned from queens like Isabella, Catherine, and Blanche. Power in female hands is to be feared. At the same time, the historical record shows that these queens were not one-dimensional villains. They were mothers, patrons, rulers, and survivors. They used every tool available: marriage, diplomacy, religion, rumor, and sometimes cruelty, to navigate a world built against them. The label of evil obscures their intelligence, foresight, and influence. History has long cast medieval queens as villains. But modern analysis reveals something far more complex. These women were strategists, survivors, and rulers operating in a brutal system that demanded ruthlessness. Take Catherine de' Medici. Centuries of rumor painted her as a poisoner, a manipulator, and a master of terror. Yet documents reveal a ruler carefully balancing factional wars, protecting her children, and preserving the monarchy in a country torn apart by religious civil war. Her so-called evil was often political necessity, interpreted through the lens of fear and misogyny. Blanche of Castile was labeled strict and severe, accused of cruelty toward rebellious nobles. But her decisions stabilized France after years of civil unrest. She protected her son, centralized power, and ensured a dynasty that would endure. Her ruthlessness was strategic, not personal. Isabella of France, the she-wolf of England, overthrew her husband, navigated rebellion, and protected her son's claim. Her ambition was feared, yet it secured the Lancastrian line and reshaped English history. Modern historians now recognize a pattern. Queens were judged more harshly than kings, even when using the same tools. Their evil acts often preserved dynasties or stabilized kingdoms. Their influence extended beyond their lifetimes, shaping nations politically, socially, and culturally. The myth of the evil queen persists because it is simple and dramatic. Fairy tales, literature, and media continue to depict ambitious women as manipulative or cruel. The archetype is deeply rooted in cultural memory, a reflection of fear, bias, and patriarchal control. Yet the reality shows something remarkable. These queens were masters of politics. They used marriage alliances to secure peace or power, religion to justify action and maintain authority, rumor and perception to neutralize enemies, timing and strategy to survive in lethal environments, resilience and adaptability to endure betrayal, rebellion, and court intrigue. Every decision, however harsh, was part of survival in a world designed to eliminate women in power. Their lives were often lonely, filled with constant threat, moral compromise, and public scrutiny. Yet they shaped history, not merely reacted to it. The kingdoms they stabilized, the dynasties they preserved, and the cultural memory they left behind demonstrate intelligence, foresight, and indomitable will. The legacy of medieval evil queens teaches us. Power is dangerous, but often misunderstood. Ambition is necessary, but judged unfairly. History remembers fear, but rarely context. By studying these women carefully, we uncover rulers, mothers, and strategists whose brilliance ensured survival in the harshest conditions imaginable. In the end, the evil queen was not always evil. She was a product of her world. She was a survivor in a world built against her. She was intelligence, ruthlessness, and foresight made flesh. And her shadow continues to echo across centuries, reminding us that history is shaped not just by kings, armies, or wars, but by the women who dared to rule in impossible times.